All right, we're ready when you are. Go for it.
Hi everyone, good evening. Very warm welcome to the launch of Professor Yvette Taylor's latest book, Working Class Quiz. Can everyone hear me okay so far? Is that all right, microphone wise, for everyone online as well? So thank you very much to everyone at Lighthouse Books for hosting this launch tonight, and a big thanks to Yvette for writing what I think is a fabulous, really important book that I know that I'm going to be thinking about and thinking with for a really long time. I'm not going to spend too long by way of introductions, but I'll just say that unless you know already, Yvette is a feminist and a professor and a teacher at the University of Strathclyde. And over to you, Yvette, to talk us about your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. I realise it's funny outside, so double thanks. Thanks, friends in the room. If you're not my friend already, please become my friend. Thanks to Lighthouse and of course to Maddie, who I've had the pleasure of working with on different projects, different books, for a long time now. So thanks, Maddie. I am going to start by reading out something in my acknowledgement. This is a book that has been written over 2 decades, and within that, there's interviews. It's involved interviews with over 250 people. It's involved other types of data collection too, and there's no way that I can contain those interviews, that material in this book. This is my best attempt. So to acknowledge that this book was written during a global pandemic, during austerity, during global recession, and into the cost of living crisis. To write this is to acknowledge the times we're in and stretching backwards and forwards. To write now is to complicate crisis as exceptional, resolved by DIY individualism, resource management, austerity, deferral, or in keeping writing. And yet I have kept writing, enabled and supported by the people in and beyond these book pages, and often as queer feminist solidarity and persistence. I write hopeful of something different rather than a return to business as usual. We'd all remember that phrase. In this book, I ask if this might be a queer left hope animated by working class queer life. So I identify and query. I don't think it's an automatic or an easy identification. I identify as somebody who's working class and that I'm queer, and I ask what that's meant over a 20-year period of doing research in by for working class queers. I ask what it means to find a place as a researcher, as a writer, as an academic, and I view that as intersectional as a practice rather than an easy statement. And I don't think it's static, it is changing, and I don't expect my interviews to be fixed or just one thing. I think sometimes when you express an interest in class, you can already be written off. The response can be, oh, well, it's not just about class. And so when I say up front, I'm not saying it's just ever about class, it never is. But I think one of the quotes that really stood out for me, and I used quite early on in the collection, is a sense, and it's from an interview that called Alicia, it's all pseudonyms, that she imagines her future at all points as someone who's not fitting into the world, and it's just sometimes the world is not for you. So that sense of misfit. I've asked Maddie to help me here with turning the pages and so on. Like I said, I use different material, and I hope to have highlighted, and I'll talk about the selection of particular interviews as well. But one of the other body of data that I explored was the Lesbian Archive at Glasgow Women's Library, and the first page opens with an extract, and it's a conversation over different magazines about class as a feminist. issue, and I've titled that "I'm a Working Class Woman, OK?" And it was kind of interesting hearing that battle and hearing the fights then and now, the past and the present, and that is a continued dispute through feminism. So who gets to assert that I'm a working class woman, OK, and what kind of claims for identification, authenticity, what else is invoked and denied in that claim? In terms of, I hope to have woven some of my story into this in terms of feminist practice and situating myself. And that was quite hard to do. And I think I'm going to read out one of the quotes that somebody who I talked to pretty late in the research, and we're talking about class and activism. So I'll read out their quote. This is somebody, so like I said, working class people don't remain static, they can experience the educational social mobility as well. So this is somebody like myself who's now working in a middle class area of academia. You can always tell a real working class person because they want to be middle class, not the culture of middle class, but they want a good salary and they want the money and they don't disdain those things. I've got a colleague who'd be like, everybody should be paid the same, and they used to say all that stuff as well. But it'll be working class job applicants at senior level who'll be like, no, pay me my fucking salary. Do you know what I mean? I crawled over glass to get here. Pay me my salary. It's only middle class people that romanticize being poor. And she talks about in that moment that sometimes like her bank card doesn't work and it bleeps, and she'd let that filter with panic. So for me, that again shows the past and the present, like the way that kid class can be embodied and felt as an emotion, as panic too. So I wanted to give you a sense of some interviewees' stories, not just my own story, and I wanted to pull out commonalities in the book across that 20-year period, from say the hope of New Labour through the austerity crisis, the recessions, the crisis, the cost of living crisis that we now find ourselves in through Brexit, which of course is still playing out. And so I interviewed a variety of people across the age range, people with disabilities, people of colour, and I wanted to really think about who we recruit and who typically comes forward in queer projects. Is it mostly white, middle class, gay, cisgendered people that come forward, and how can we navigate that as researchers? And sometimes we have to kind of close the door to make space too. And I talk about that in a section I call projecting whiteness. So how in our projects we do whiteness, and how we might name rather than disguise our own positionality and our own whiteness in particular. Lots of experiences that interviews had in common included homelessness, poor housing, unemployment, underemployment, precarity, experience of the asylum seeking process, experience of being a key worker, and one of the chapters is specifically on the pandemic, the experience of homophobia, of transphobia, and supposedly new times of protected legislation and Rainbow Europe and landscape. So let me keep an eye on time and I'll go through the stories and Maddie will tell me when to stop, I think. So I wanted to begin with Asifa's story, and Asifa is somebody that I interviewed in Manchester in 2002. It's a different time in Manchester. It was kind of known still as the North, and it comes with all those connotations of being post-industrial, working class. But it was also at that time had a very vibrant LGBT scene space, still has to some extent. I think some of that has been threatened. And part of Asifa's story was maybe not being recognised as queer in queer spaces. We met in a big community space in 2002, and it was quite a rundown space. I mean, at least it was a physical space, and I think some of those spaces have retracted and are under threat but it was sustained by a lot of voluntary labour. It felt quite precarious, it felt cold, and it felt surrounded by a lot of literature which was fairly medicalised, and so, which is to say, it didn't really feel like our space. So one of the things Assefa starts with was that I always felt at the bottom of the hierarchy, or I felt that I was being put at the bottom. I don't know necessarily that I felt that I was at the bottom. And one of the key things about Assefa's story was that our interview happened just after 9/11, and she talks about that as like a defining moment of politicization, but also experienced racism daily, including in queer spaces. She also talked about coming out and trying to really challenge that story that she was caught between two worlds somehow, that she was between the Asian community and a white British community or same space. And she had been homeless, and she accessed women's refuge, and she was quite critical of this discourse of she was being saved through white feminism. So I think Assefa's account really resonates with other accounts that are from interviews that I interviewed in 2020 and 21, Alicia and Nika, who we might meet a bit later on. I might jump to Abby's story, and I'm kind of moving backwards. So I started with a chapter that comes towards the end. It's chapter 6, and it's called Queer Anachronisms. Sometimes it will be left as a discipline, as a space of activism, doesn't necessarily fit with queer life and experience. So going back again, this is from chapter 5, and it's on queers and austerity, and I highlight what I've called different austerity themes. And one of the interviewees there is Abby, who is disabled, and I interviewed Abby in 2013, and this was just after the cuts to disability benefits. So Abby says, and I think Abby, like many, use different terms to describe themselves, as omni, pan-romantic, asexual, lesbian women, changing terms throughout the course of our interview. So I've known people who've been assaulted in the street for being disabled, because the current war on disabled people in this country, when it comes to benefits, is just eye-scratching game, I think. I just keep myself away from people who are negative, like wheel a few feet back. So for me, Abby's story really highlights what a couple of academics have asked the question, what is working class queer religion? And I've used Abby's story and another interview story to highlight what I think that could be. So in a moment where the welfare state retracts, could we see religion as a space of investment and care rather than automatically oppositional to sexuality? For example, it's really hard to select stories to share with you tonight, and it's been really hard to do that in between these pages when you know I've interviewed and tried to held together so many stories and see what connects across those stories as well, what's changed and what's stayed the same. I think I'll maybe pause there, Mandy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I love how you pulled out your participant stories and talking to us all this evening. And I should have said at the beginning, sorry, I forgot. I was so excited to get to the book, but I should have said what we're going to do at this book launch is Yvette is going to talk for a little while about the book. I have a few questions I pre-prepared that I'm going to ask Yvette, and then we'll open the floor and open up online for questions from anyone here tonight. So sorry I didn't provide that information at the beginning, but thank you so much for talking us through some of your participants' lives and data and lively data and stories. Should we move to questions, Karina? Is that okay? Okay. So first of all, I wanted to ask about, you've mentioned this already, how Working Class Queers is grounded in an incredible 20 years of research and data. And thinking about the way that you reflect on that in the book, you often mention this idea of sort of repetitions and the way that like queer class issues, fights ideas like reoccur and repeat in these sort of circuitous loops. So I wanted to ask you, having done that 20 years of research about queer, about class, what do you think is a particularly common repetition that's come up in that project, or a particularly important repetition, or a particularly frustrating repetition for you to encounter over and over again? And what does that repetition tell us about working class queer lives?
Good, yeah. I mean, I suppose I pointed to some of the commonalities and as well as the differences. So to nuance that category and experience of working class students, when it's just usually imagined or more easily imagined as attached to, say, like and I think it's an old attachment and it's romanticized and like older white masculinity. So to reimagine that and to change that repetitious pattern, for me, one of the frustrating disciplinary repetitions, frustrations, is that divide. I still think it's true between sexuality studies and class studies. So maybe we could reimagine working class and class studies as already quite a queer discipline, rather than it being located through the same body of writers. And I talk about that as a reader and as a writer, like what would it mean to produce, and the book ends on chapter 7, which is towards a queer working class reading list. Can we imagine working class queer lives as part of that academic production and beyond academia too? So how did we take up space, as queer feminists too? So my strategy in moving across those 20 years and thinking about the fieldwork and what's changed, because things have changed too, and things have stayed the same. It's not necessarily just to get frustrated or to get stuck in my own repetitious loop either, that working class queers matter, and clearly I think that they do. But also I think through, well, what does thinking through the past enable? How can we think through the past and to think about the present, and maybe to take us to a future where we stop just saying, oh, here we are again, like working class queers experience homelessness, experience poverty, and to complicate it, they do experience these structural inequalities, but they're not just stuck by them either. So what can working class queers tell us about middle class life too, for example? And can they complicate that category? Can you ever get to become like respectable or normative if you are working class? Do you ever get to inhabit same space, for example? Going back to some of the stories that I've said. So yeah, I mean, clearly I'll still keep writing about working class queers. Yeah. So I'm not sure if repetition would be the main way that I would kind of conceptualize it. Because I don't want just to be repeating that frustration or that kind of loss of the left, but to say that actually some of the things that I see happening in working class life, they're already taking us places, and maybe they need to be seen and valued. And mutual aid would be one of those examples that I could point to. People during the pandemic, I think, became more aware of this as a possibility, right? And this may be something new, but actually I think lots of interviews where, as part of their daily life, as part of that sort of pragmatic orientation and existence in the everyday world, we're already doing mutual aid. We might not see it as that. One of the stories, Jasleen, who was a key worker and sending money back home to Philippines, was precariously placed as working in the NHS, not recognised as queer by her queer circle, and they would say, do you know that this is a queer space? So had to kind of navigate that, as well as sending money back home during the pandemic and being not properly seen as British. So in response to my call, Jasleen said, yes, I'm working class and I'm queer, but I'm not too sure about the British point because I haven't been here long enough. So what I want to sort of imagine or repeat is that, because I think I started there, is that how do we see working classness and queer working classness as implicating global workers, as not necessarily attached to nationhood and whiteness and being British or being Scottish. That's
Thank
great.
you so much.
Thank you.
Take a breath. Thank you so much. Such a comprehensive answer. And I think, you know, the questions that I'm asking, and I think the questions that you're going to be asking too, probably expand out beyond this room as well. Like a lot to think about, you know, in conversation with the book, in conversation with each other. And that leads nicely on to my next question, which is, I think more than anything else I've read, definitely more than the vast majority of sort of academic and scholarly books that I've read, working class queers, the way that you work with qualitative data in this book, for me, when as a reader, really like expands out beyond the page. Like you really get a sense of participants' lives, their politics, their investments as sort of stretched beyond what we see in the book. And I think that's a real skill and a real achievement in the book. It's exemplary at pointing to like the liveliness of data. I think a lot of you know, qualitative research can run the risk of sort of detaching people's words from their lives and almost like extracting the data from the person, from the community. And I think, you know, you've used qualitative interviews, but you've used very innovative and creative participatory methods. Some of my favorite examples are in chapter 2, where you talk about the undoing of queer class data. So we see images of like the boxes of the archives sitting in the Glasgow Women's Library. We see, you know, the location of Glasgow Women's Library shifting through time. We hear about Yvette going into the library at different points in time. And I think the way that you've used personal narratives, some autobiographical data, some autoethnographic reflections builds to this overall picture of sort of liveliness. And I think that gives readers a chance to imagine their lives in relation to this book, as well as imagining participants going beyond the page. So I wanted to ask you, as a researcher, how do you negotiate the dilemma of representing queer class lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's always a struggle, and it's always in some ways going to be a failure. My job is kind of present and select and be honest about that, rather than trying to capture our own or contain. So, you know, any book production is always incomplete. I think all you can do is try best select, right? And that starts, so that doesn't just start when you are at the stage of writing up. It starts with the call for participants and being deliberate and thoughtful about who and where and how to recruit. You know, going beyond, say, central Scotland, going to rural places, and certainly I hope to have done that. But also, it's like, well, who's depicted as queer right now? And like I've already talked about the way that can be quite that can prioritize certain voices, and so sometimes it's about holding back so that we get more diverse participants. I've deliberately selected underrepresented accounts, and I mean, maybe I can tell this through a couple of stories. So Farge is one of the accounts that I've highlighted in chapter 4. It's called Queer Provincialisms in Post-Brexit Britain. And Farge's account is quite complicated in that Farge had identified as middle class, but as a result of crossing different borders and experiencing racism, has now experience what they would call as downward mobility, and is quite a positive view of Scotland and its, in its entirety, and as a safe space. And so I spend quite a lot of time in Farge's story, because it's maybe not the typical story that you hear right now in Scotland, of, say, when you're looking at the Scottish Parliament's claims about LGBT inclusive curriculum, or Scotland being the best place in the world, and you can always raise an eyebrow at that, about being more inclusive. So I think it's about who and what you select and who you kind of showcase, and not maybe also pointing to the gaps and the silences, because sometimes, and I've wrote about this in terms of having stories to tell, being able to already like convey your coming out story, which is, it can be classed in itself. It can be involve that narration of independence, having something like going to university, moving city, get into a queer space, a queer scene space, and that narration of kind of identity and becoming, and is already, I think, told in very, very classed ways. So how do we look beyond those go-to narratives and who is not there? So one of the stories that I tell in the book is about the workshop that Maddie's talked about, in terms of the, having the boxes of data in front of you, having a workshop with participants from different backgrounds and seeing what happens in that space, and something that's always happening in spaces. But one of the things that I pause on is who's not in the room, and I had invited a younger participant to be part of that workshop, and in some ways this was somebody who could have known about Glasgow Women's Library, even as it's changed spaces. They were from the local area, but they viewed that as quite a long journey, like emotionally, materially, that they didn't think that it was their space. And so despite my invitation and encouragement, they just didn't make it, because it would involve a long story to their mum. They didn't really want to come out. We had already met, and they weren't before that, and they weren't sure about the city centre. So this was all like sort of knowingness that they didn't have, and we're wrestling with, like, do I get the bus, or do I walk, or do I ask my mum for a lift, and how do I even get there? So, I tried to balance that around what happened in the room and who else wasn't there. So it's about those kind of silences and gaps too, I think.
Thank you so much, Yvette. And I'd just like to say I really admire the way that you do name those silences and gaps in your work. I think it's like a tricky thing to pull off sometimes. Like, how do you attend to the silence, the gap, the absence, without sort of reinforcing that absence or reifying it? And I think you've done a fantastic job in this book. So I think, looking at the time, maybe just one more quick question from me, and then we'll open to the floor. So if you're thinking of any questions for Yvette, now is the time to start preparing those, getting ready, especially if you're online as well. And I think everyone will have a lot of really good questions. So the final quick one from me, one of the things that I love about this book is you also really get a sense of like movement through time. Like, we look back, we look forward. The past, the present, and the future are like very much present throughout many of the chapters. So with that in mind, I wonder, knowing what you know now, having written the book after 20 years of research, what advice would you give to the Yvette of 20 years ago? Because we meet her in the book. She goes to a Marxist conference, she moves between that conference and the scene space, and she negotiates all of that, among many other things. So what would the Yvette of 20 years ago say after reading this book, do you think?
It's a good question, good thing, thinking positive. But yeah, I find myself, what was I say younger? I mean, so one of the workshop activities in the book was asking participants in the workshop to, and it was around section 20, section 2A in Scotland, around the prohibition of homosexuality, and participants were asked to write to, say, Margaret Thatcher or Brian Sutter. The postcards are in the book. And what would they say? Or to write to maybe a school teacher, or indeed to write to their younger self. And there's like powerful kind of speaking back through time. Some participants did kind of don't do that, like you will make it, you will get there, and I suppose it's reminiscent of that, like things will get better narrative. So I kind of want to resist that. Like I don't know if I've got advice for younger Yvette, or like to do differently, because I think she did all right. And I suppose that like that lesson from the present to the past, and I want to kind of mix that up, because I think something, including my own academic journey, which I do move through being an undergraduate to what does it mean to have my own feminist queer classroom. And I think I call that something like From the Bottom reading group, which I was in, by the way, to A Room of Her Own. And so, you know, is that you taking up space and have you made it? And I think younger Yvette would be like totally ambivalent about that. Like, is this a space for me? And I think that question over time has been pretty productive for me too. And I think it's worth holding in head, like, have we all still made it? Is this where we're going? Is this what we want? So I don't know if I have a to-do list, other than I suppose like the to-do is like to look at our lives through the lens of class and sexuality and intersectional inequalities. And I say that fast because I want to hear your questions. But so my lens of looking at it back forward through the queer left, which is always going to be intersectional in its imagination. I sometimes pause, and I'm not unique in that pause. I think feminism has paused over the misuse of intersectionality and you know, the way that it's got a common currency, and that might be good, but there also might be flaws in that, like it might be misused. So one of the and this is not just a problem for Will, by the way. I mean, I use Will as an example, who is saying to me, I have an intersectional orientation. I am intersectional. I, you know, support these movements and I do these things in my life, and I am intersectional. And I think we need to be hesitant about thinking about ourselves as intersectional, as owning it, as having it as an identity, rather than as a practice, and a practice that is done across time and that often fails but is returned to nonetheless. So I want to kind of give up that intersectional I as us in the room, but I think about then how can that be a gesture towards a different kind of politics that is always ongoing in our book productions, in our reading list, and other aspects. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I knew when I asked that question that you wouldn't have a to-do list for the end of it, but I still wanted to hear your answer. Maybe we could take a little pause just for a round of applause. For so, time for questions, I think. Would anyone like to start us off?
There were two online, so if you guys want a chance to catch your question. The first is from Layla. This is fascinating, thank you. Can you speak at all to any observations you drew from your research about working class queer creatives or poor queers in the arts?
So I'm not like, I mean, I think that's part of the difficulty sometimes in interviewing so many people. Sometimes you can't imagine specific jobs that people are doing. I try to so I'm not sure if they're talking about like working class queers and the arts sector per se, and I would need to pause on that maybe. I hope that in doing the project that I opened it up for sort of artistic representation, and one of the artists that I work with, and their art work is in the very front pages of on the flyer for working class queers. I try to incorporate like words and tables and drawings and maps. but I'm not sure if I can think about that as a sector per se. I would imagine it would resonate with a lot of potential, a lot of the social cultural precarity faced by a lot of workers. And I mentioned as Lena, somebody who's working in the NHS. Quite a few people worked in, say, third sector organisations. And there's quite a few people who weren't able to work because their asylum claim was pending. So I would need to think about that more, and I certainly will in terms of types of workers. So thanks for the question. Get back to me, be in touch.
The one in the room, burning question. Okay, you have time. One more from Joe. I've come to realize it has felt harder over time to break free from restrictions of class than it has of queerness. Does this personal experience track against what you discovered over the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like I think there are sort of structural supports which become inequalities if you don't have those ways that say middle class queers can become more visible and access queer life. I talk about sort of university LGBT plus societies, for example. But that said, I mean, a lot of respondents says, look, working class life is queer too. There are queers in working class places. It's just that often they're not sort of heard or recognised or imagined. And so quite a lot of the time, Mandy was saying that, you've been doing this research quite well, and I've interviewed hundreds of people, but people will say, but where did you find them? Like assuming that they're not there already. And I think it is to query that imagination as working class life is only straight. So I happen to have another quote here from Dan, and Dan says, they think people in working class council estates are Brexit crazy, unionist, racist, homophobic. There's no place for us there. There's just no LGBTQ there, which is a lie, which is just not true. So I wonder, I think there are real material constraints, but let's challenge the view that working class life is, say, as Anne says, is automatically homophobic. It's not. And I think sometimes we do another disservice there, because who's the power for like structural homophobia, which might be like less easy to, it might be more invisible by liberal middle class policy makers, for example. So just creating that a little bit.
Yep. Thank you.
Are there any questions in the room? Go ahead.
You mentioned you not being acceptable to queer spaces. Do you find that there is a lot of classism within this?
Yeah, so one of the austerity themes that I talked about, and it was during, I guess, sort of from 2008, 2009, I did a project on parenting, and if so, that was before, it was after the Partnership Act, but before the Same-Sex Marriage Act, and there was like a palpable difference in the way that middle class and working class people told their parenting story. Like, I don't think working class people told their parenting story. Like, they had kids, right? And so that route to parents and that parenting journey and like being active with the school and challenging the school was like a big class difference, because often working class parents had been told that they failed at school and they were also in the bottom reading group. But in parenting groups, and including ones that were like creative and imaginative and doing things like walks and picnics in the parks, like people talked about the class as like this visceral divide. It was heard that it was about people doing certain things or talking to their kids in certain ways, or the music they listened to about being too loud in the park. So I think that's like where you see some of the some of the more social, cultural, emotional aspects of class at work. I think there's a hand up at the back and then down here at the front. Do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, sorry. You touched briefly on section 28 and section 2A in Scotland there. It was quite an important thing for me, actually. I didn't even know it was existing when I was growing up. And then I discovered that coming from a working class space, I just met people, middle class people who went to private schools where it didn't impact on them, and they had a lot more access to information on different sexualities and all that kind of possibilities there. Did you find in your research that section 28 was something that your participants were aware of? Did it impact them at all, or was it just something that completely passed them by, and there were other influences on other things that impacted them more?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started interviewing in 2001, I interviewed people from 16. I think the oldest person was 79, and so some of them, many of them had journeyed through that moment, and some section 28 wasn't imposed, but they weren't having great experiences at school. So I think I'm of that generation where section 28 was imposed, and felt. I think it's really interesting because even for the young people who were been interviewed much later on, they still talked about section 28, section 2, and they're imagining, so somehow they knew that that was a significant moment for LGBT plus community, even though it wasn't their experience. So I think like those collective moments still circulate, and I think particularly around what's happening in the UK and other parts of the world around the resonances and trans lives in particular, like in that parallel between right-wing hostility and that reimagining it, despite the idea that things are getting better, that lots of people talked about or we're actively imagining Europe, say, as a better place than England, and Scotland's awkward navigation within that. But we're really panicked by that Brexit moment, and things could get worse. And one of the Nika, and because I've got these stories, and I'm like, you must hear these stories. And Nika is a young person living in 23, living in the Highlands in Scotland as mixed race, and I think through the imagination of a white rural space, and for me, when I interviewed Nika, I was going back to that place that I remember 20 years before that, I'd been in the exact same place when I was meeting the rural lesbian group at that time. And Nika's words and story is very powerful, because part of her imagining is that she ends her story with this tell me how common or how limited life expectancy is for trans people. So it's like that. Well, how far really have we moved then? When that discourse of like, death and despair is right there.
I think you had your question just here.
But maybe specific negotiating invisibility class member, and do you think that kind of invisibilities are similar or different?
How do we survive in academia full stop at the moment where moment of cutting back, and when we hear that international students are not really welcome, and so it's a difficult moment to inhabit, and I think it's ongoing work, right? I mean, you have your allies, you have your feminist spaces that you can invest in, and you can do feminist activism, reading, and then through those spaces, and part of the effort, I think the reason why it's worth it is to expand that idea of a feminist classroom beyond the university to allow work in a particular university that sort of pitches itself, and I think Matthew, you would likely say the same if your own institution as a widening participation university, but we can be really sceptical of that, and we can always bring that into question, like widening participation where, for who, and diversity, right, or EDI for who and for what, and who has to do that work too. So I think we can be skeptical and question of the places that we inhabit, and university is one place we inhabit. I see it as a place sometimes, so I want to be skeptical and question without completely cynical. Having cycled through different repetitious feelings about that, like, because I think sometimes you do get exhausted, and I think the UCU strikes, and as with other strikes and other work, it can be exhausting. So you have to remind yourself of where you're going and why and who matters. But I kind of lost my train of thought there. That's why I don't want to be so cynical where I'm like, university is not a real place, or the real reality or activism exists somewhere else, because I think that we just risk seeing the university as this detached entity. And I'm like, okay, look at the work that has gone before us, the work that it's taken for me to enter university, and I want to keep going. The question of survival, right? That question mark around that still, I think.
Are there any questions from online?
No, there's some thank yous, but
I think that's a really important question that you just asked, and I like the way that it has responded. I think there's no easy answer to that question, right? How to survive or keep going in a space that in lots of ways wasn't designed to include you. Is anyone else thinking about similar? Fiona, have you got your hand up at the back?
I do. And I really like your point a bit about addressing who's not in the room as well, who's not made it. We all have positions that we're doing research. We're like, where's everybody at? Do you have any tips or tricks for how to hold that within research, to get those voices within the context?
I mean, yeah. So I think it is about naming and being conscious of when people are not in the room and who's not there, because sometimes it is like we're speaking for everyone, and it's that pretense of being inclusive or universal or speaking for everywhere when we're somewhere specific, right? So I think it is about just like thinking about who can't we reach, and maybe, you know, one of the things that I was critical of, and I talk about that in relation to sort of voluntarily sustained LGBT spaces through time, is that notion of outreach as well. It's like sometimes been quite patronising. So the space that I'm in with ASIFA back in 2002, that we're kind of being told that we're dirty and out of place and like need to go and speak to sexual services. So like sometimes activists or non-academic spaces kind of get it wrong too, and we need to be skeptical of that outreach. Like we just need to extend our reach further. Like sometimes it's like I can't reach these groups because I'm not part of these groups either, and navigating that. But sometimes I have said I'm getting respondents back. I've put out my call for participants, and they're all like they can be captured with certain categories, and I need to say no, which is really hard. Because of course, like in the parenting project, the parents I spoke about in terms of being quite privileged and being able to present as good parents who have the best interest of the child at heart, they're still, you know, they're still subject to homophobia. And so I don't want to kind of write those accounts off completely. I'm like, I want to be respectful when people do come forward and say I'm willing to speak, but sometimes that can be about already having a confidence that you have got a story to tell. And a number of and so I think more middle class people are more easily able to do that. And on like big commonality, big repetition is working class queer people I've interviewed saying, is this what you want? Do you want to know this? much more hesitant about the accounts that they earn, to think that I'm even interested in them. So that would be. So I think that's an ongoing question, Fiona.
Okay, looks like there's time for one last. Yeah, go for it.
My question is about if you have any observations of when sort of class transcends and social becomes more about social class and feel that social. And I wonder if that's the research.
Yeah, yeah, definitely want to always be kind of complicating class beyond account or a bracket as though it's just an income, and those things are really significant, like it's just a qualification. And I think that is a tricky balance to say, look, class stays with you, it stays with you in your body as well. It's written in our skin, it's how we recognise people, it's all those interpersonal nuances, and you know, I'm not alone in writing and thinking. It's through the ways that class works intimately, socially, culturally, you know, as well as in terms of what we have financially. But I think it's just balancing that and saying, but of course, class also changes as well. And maybe this is something younger Yvette would be less sure about. And you know, so when I'm in my best behaviour, I can also say that middle classness as a category is also complicated and has its own kind of queerness too. So I'm interested in the way that it always circulates, and some people, they know who they are, will want to shut you down as soon as you mention class as well. And I think that's an interesting moment of class happening right there. But I think it's like about naming that without being holding it with care. Like I've got a political vocabulary uncertainty around class because of my feminism, because of my lots of other things too. But I don't want to entrench that as an automatic or singular category, because I think some of the ways that has been misused has particularly been around race. So can it be stretched to?
Okay, so I think we might be approaching the end of our allotted time, but I know that Yvette has several pen options for signing any copies that anyone may wish to be so blessed. I want to say a big thank you to everyone for coming along tonight, for everyone who's been online, and a gigantic thank you to Yvette for sharing your work with us tonight. And yeah, I know that this book is going to be really important for a lot of people in a lot of different places, something that we're going to be talking about, thinking about, hopefully in conversation with you for a very long time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.